Two states, one name. Why did America's most similar siblings choose a 300-year divorce? Their split wasn't about rivalry. It was a desperate escape from a failed utopian experiment and a reign of chaos so total that the survivors begged the king to take the mess back. Why are there two Carolinas in the United States? North Carolina and South Carolina are so culturally similar. They are so close politically that many Americans don't understand why they are separate. The split of these two Carolinas predates the history of the United States itself. And it was a great relief for all parties involved. The Carolina region later welcomed its first European visitors. The Spanish arrived in 1512. But they never named or colonized the area. The French arrived in the 1560s. The English later arrived as well. But their colony on Roanoke Island vanished without a trace. For the next few decades, Europeans paid no more attention to this place. Until 1629, King Charles I granted a charter for colonization to Sir Robert Heat. But he did not develop it. Apart from some unofficial Virginia settlers, the Europeans left again, and peace returned. Until 1663, King Charles II, to reward their loyalty, granted this land to 8 nobles known as the Lords Proprietors, and named the entire region Carolina. A few years later, the first permanent settlement, Charleston, was established. Subsequently, more settlers arrived. However, differences between North Carolina and South Carolina gradually emerged. Charleston and other settlements in South Carolina were primarily owned by slaveholders and West Indian planters. They mainly operated sheep farming. They sought new land to run commercial farms. South Carolina was ideal for growing sugarcane and rice. Slave plantations spread across the region, supported by wealthy merchants. Meanwhile, European settlers congregated in towns like Charleston, where slave exports were as important as imports. Between 1670 and 1715, over 25,000 indigenous people were enslaved in South Carolina. Simultaneously, a comparable number of black slaves were brought in. By the mid-18th century, the majority of South Carolina's residents were slaves. Most white people were wealthy, living in cities or between the two. The northern rural areas were far less dependent on slavery. Slavery existed there too, especially in tobacco cultivation. But most settlers were relatively poor. In fact, many of them were indentured servants from other colonies and could never afford their own slaves. North Carolina quickly gained a reputation for attracting the roughest and poorest colonists, while the wealthy migrated south. As a result, North Carolina had the densest population. But South Carolina was the wealthiest. A good government could have worked to bridge this divide. But the proprietors did the opposite. 8 individuals far away in London, each with their own opinions, governed a vast territory across the Atlantic. Is it any wonder the government was so chaotic? Carolina was too vast to control effectively. The new leaders also couldn't manage. Indifference, incompetence, and excessive ambition competed among these 8 men. The residents of Carolina could only watch wearily. Excessive ambition ultimately prevailed. Thanks to Lord Anthony Ashley Cooper, the Earl of Shaftesbury, he intended to build Carolina into an ideal society. He consulted the philosopher John Locke. They drafted an experimental legal system called the Fundamental Constitutions of Carolina. This constitution outlined a plan for a peculiar society, promoting both individual freedom and liberalism, while also supporting slavery and a hereditary nobility. There was also urban planning, aiming to maximize efficiency, safety, and beauty in future cities. This was a bold attempt for any government. Therefore, the plan ultimately failed in the hands of the proprietors, due to Charleston's difficulties in communication and transportation with the North. The laws made by the Lords had significantly weakened influence over the colonial capital. Local governments took on responsibility, allowing towns and communities to manage their own affairs, without relying too much on Charleston or London. A distant government quickly became synonymous with corruption and inefficiency. This view became increasingly common in the colony. Distrust and resentment towards the Lords in the northern region were severe. Colonel John Culpeper of Albemarle County launched a bloodless rebellion. Culpeper gathered several dozen men, arrested the proprietor's lawyer, and organized his own election. Culpeper was summoned to England to stand trial as a rebel. but the Earl of Shaftesbury ultimately supported him. Shaftesbury acknowledged that North Carolina had no real government. Therefore, Culpeper and his supporters had every right to resist anything claiming to be a government. Culpeper was acquitted. This was an embarrassing proof for the Lords. News of chaos and mismanagement continued to spread. New settlers left Carolina for other settlements like Pennsylvania. To attract more immigrants, the proprietors rewrote the fundamental constitutions at least 3 times in 1682. This only made critics more convinced the government had failed. North Carolina residents continued to resist, constantly rebelling against the Lords. Southerners deemed their neighbors uncontrollable ruffians. In 1711, Thomas Carey led a bloodless rebellion, directly targeting proprietor Edward Hyde, showing that colonial governance was still not improving. 1711 became the most difficult year yet. Besides Carey's rebellion, the area also suffered a severe drought and an outbreak of yellow fever. But the greatest test came from Native Americans. In September 1711, the Tuscarora tribe in North Carolina decided they had endured enough settler oppression and launched a surprise attack. Within a week, the Tuscarora killed hundreds of settlers, burned farms, slaughtered livestock, swept through North Carolina. Most colonists were killed. Most major settlements were severely damaged. When British relief forces arrived, the entire area was nearly desolate. The Tuscarora tribe gradually declined in the following years, but the damage they caused in initial battles was extremely severe. The situation deteriorated so much that authorities suggested completely abandoning North Carolina and relocating survivors south, but most survivors refused to leave. This became the final straw. After decades of poor management, frequent rebellions, economic inequality, and famous conflicts with natives, everyone had had enough. Since North Carolina was in ruins and seen as an irreparable loss, the settlers decided to separate North and South Carolina into distinct administrations, if only to be rid of the burden. North Carolina would be returned to the king as an independent royal colony. This mess was for him to handle. The proposal was almost unanimously approved. On January 24, 1712, North Carolina and South Carolina officially split into 2 separate colonies, to ensure the two would never reunite. Although South Carolina eventually freed itself from proprietor control and officially became a colony in 1719, no one ever seriously pushed for reunification. The 2 Carolinas shared nothing but their name and poor leadership. Long-standing hostility between them quickly faded. The 2 colonies coexisted harmoniously, rebelling together against British rule 2 weeks after the American Revolutionary War began. On May 23, 1778, South Carolina became the 8th state of the United States. North Carolina became the 12th state in November of the following year.